"Ma'am, you can't be in here." The voice was sharp enough to cut through the quiet boardroom. Several executives turned toward the doorway just in time to see the security manager step forward, blocking the woman who had just walked inside. He pointed toward the hallway. "This meeting is for owners and board members only." The woman didn't argue. She simply looked at him, calm, patient, almost curious. For a moment, no one in the room said anything. Then one of the investors laughed softly, because they recognized her, not as an executive, not as an investor, but as the housekeeper they had seen earlier that morning pushing a cleaning cart through the hotel hallways. One of the men leaned back in his chair and whispered to the person beside him. "Wrong floor," he muttered with a smirk. A few people chuckled. After all, just hours earlier, they had watched her wipe down elevator mirrors, roll fresh towels down the corridor, and quietly move her housekeeping cart out of their way. One of the guests had even snapped his fingers at her. "Move the cart," he had said impatiently. "Some of us actually pay to stay here." She hadn't argued then either. She had simply nodded and stepped aside. Now she stood in the boardroom doorway, looking around the table at the same faces that had laughed at her. The security manager cleared his throat again. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave." That's when the woman finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'm afraid I can't do that." The room grew quieter. The man frowned. And why exactly not? She opened the folder in her hand and slid a document across the table. The chairman picked it up, and his expression changed immediately. Shock, confusion, then something much heavier, because the document revealed something none of them had expected. The quiet housekeeper standing in front of them was the new majority shareholder of the Grand Meridian Hotel, the owner. And the most uncomfortable part? She had heard every single word they said about her that morning. But to understand how a woman pushing a housekeeping cart ended up owning one of the most luxurious hotels in the city, you have to go back to the moment the insults first began. Because the guests who mocked her believed they were humiliating someone powerless. They had no idea they were standing face to face with the person who would soon control the entire building. And by the end of that day, every single one of them would wish they had treated her differently. But the most surprising part of the story is not what she did after becoming the owner. It's how she chose to deal with the situation. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, have you ever seen someone judged unfairly because of their job? Because what happened next inside the Grand Meridian Hotel is a lesson those guests would never forget. The morning had started like any other day at the Grand Meridian Hotel. Sunlight streamed through the enormous glass windows of the lobby, reflecting off polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen fireworks above the reception desk. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the cafe in the corner, mingling with the quiet hum of business travelers beginning their day. The Grand Meridian was the kind of hotel people bragged about staying in, the kind where guests expected perfection, and the kind where most people stopped noticing the staff after the first 5 minutes, especially the housekeeping staff. At 7:10 that morning, a woman in a neatly pressed housekeeping uniform pushed a small cleaning cart out of the service hallway and into the main corridor. Her name badge read, Clara Whitmore, Housekeeping. Her uniform was simple but spotless. Her hair was tied neatly at the back of her head, and her posture was straight in a way that suggested quiet discipline rather than exhaustion. Most people didn't look twice, but if they had, they might have noticed something unusual about her. She didn't move like someone rushing to finish a shift. She moved slowly, carefully, observing everything. The hallway outside the executive suites was already busy. Business travelers hurried past with briefcases. A young couple argued quietly over a misplaced room key. 2 bellhops wheeled luggage toward the elevators. Clara stopped beside a door marked Suite 1903, knocked twice, and waited. No answer. She opened the door slightly and stepped inside. The room looked exactly the way luxury hotel rooms usually looked after a night of expensive celebrations. Wrinkled sheets, empty wine glasses, a jacket tossed over the back of a chair. Clara worked quietly, smoothing the bedding and replacing the towels with practiced efficiency. But her eyes noticed things most housekeepers would ignore. The expensive watch on the dresser, the corporate documents left open on the desk, a folder with the hotel's logo printed across the front. She closed the folder gently and returned it to the desk exactly as she had found it. Then she paused, not because she was tired, but because she heard something in the hallway. Laughter. Loud, careless laughter. Moments later, the doors swung open. 3 men in expensive suits stepped inside without even looking at her. They were still mid-conversation. "I'm telling you," one of them said, loosening his tie, "if the board approves the renovation deal today, this place will double its value." Another man poured himself coffee from the machine near the minibar. "Honestly," he said, glancing around the room, "this hotel is overdue for new ownership anyway." The third man finally noticed Clara. He stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, his eyes scanned her uniform, the cart, the cleaning supplies. Then he stepped aside as if she were a piece of furniture. "Don't mind us," he said casually. "Just finish whatever you're doing." Clara nodded politely. "Of course, sir." She continued folding the linens while the men resumed their conversation. None of them lowered their voices. None of them thought she mattered enough to notice what they were saying. One of the men leaned against the desk and sighed. "You know what the problem with places like this is?" he said. "What?" "Too many people who don't belong." He gestured vaguely toward the hallway. Staff everywhere, cleaning carts, people walking around like they own the place. The other 2 men laughed. Clara kept folding the towels, carefully, quietly, and visible. Then one of the men added something that made the others laugh even harder. "You ever notice how housekeeping always looks at you like they're studying you?" Another chuckle. "Relax," the first man said. "They don't know anything about business." The room filled with laughter again. Clara finished arranging the towels and pushed the cart toward the door. As she passed them, one of the men snapped his fingers. "Hey!" She stopped. "Yes, sir? Can you make sure this room gets fresh coffee later?" "Of course." "Good," he said, waving her away. "Some of us actually have important meetings today." Clara nodded once. "Understood." Then she left the room. But the moment she stepped into the hallway, something interesting happened. Her expression changed. Not anger, not humiliation, something else. Something thoughtful, as if she had just learned something useful. Down the hall, 2 hotel employees stood near the elevator discussing the day's schedule. "The board meeting starts at 3, one of them said. "Yeah, apparently the ownership announcement is happening then." Clara paused, just for a moment. Then she continued pushing her cart down the hallway. The elevator doors opened, and a group of guests stepped inside. Clara waited politely behind them until one of the men turned and frowned. "Staff elevator's around the corner," he said. Clara gave a small smile. "Oh, I know." The doors closed. The ride down to the lobby was quiet, but the moment the elevator opened again, the energy of the hotel felt different. The lobby buzzed with anticipation. A group of investors stood near the reception desk discussing numbers. 2 executives rushed past with tablets in their hands. Someone at the concierge desk whispered, "Today's the big meeting." Clara pushed her cart slowly across the marble floor. Guests stepped around her without making eye contact. One woman wrinkled her nose as she passed. Another guest waved impatiently. "Can you move that thing?" Clara stepped aside immediately. Of course. The man rolled his suitcase past her. As he walked away, he muttered something to the person beside him. Honestly, they should keep staff out of the main lobby during business hours. The comment was quiet, but Clara heard it. She heard everything. And still, she said nothing. Instead, she pushed her cart toward the service hallway. But before she disappeared behind the door, she glanced back at the lobby one more time. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. The investors, the guests, the executives rushing past, almost like she was memorizing something. Then she disappeared down the hallway. Upstairs in suite 1903, the three businessmen were still laughing. One of them checked his watch. "Better head down soon," he said. "Wouldn't want to miss the ownership announcement." Another smirked. "Whoever buys this place better know what they're doing." The third man picked up his jacket. "Relax," he said confidently. "People like us are the ones who run hotels like this." Down the hallway, Clara Whitmore quietly placed her cleaning supplies back onto the cart. Then she looked at the small leather folder sitting on the bottom shelf. A folder that didn't belong to housekeeping. She opened it briefly. Inside were several documents. One of them bore the official seal of the Grand Meridian Hotel. And at the bottom of the page, her name, Clara Whitmore, majority shareholder. She closed the folder calmly. Then she checked the time. 2:12 p.m., less than an hour before the board meeting. Back in suite 1903, the three businessmen finished their coffee and headed toward the elevator. They were still laughing about the housekeeper, still confident, still convinced they understood exactly who mattered in that hotel. But in less than 60 minutes, they were about to walk into a boardroom and discover something that would make every word they said that morning echo in their heads. Because the quiet woman pushing the housekeeping cart wasn't just part of the staff. She was the person who now owned the entire building. And the next time they saw her, she wouldn't be wearing a housekeeping uniform. But the most surprising part, Clara Whitmore had already decided exactly how she was going to handle them. And it wasn't the kind of revenge anyone expected. But to understand why, you have to see what happened next. Because at exactly 3 p.m., the boardroom doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel would open, and several very confident guests were about to realize they had spent the morning insulting their new boss. By the time the clock in the Grand Meridian lobby struck 2:55 p.m., the entire hotel had begun to feel different. The kind of atmosphere that settles in when something important is about to happen. At the reception desk, two front desk employees whispered while pretending to organize room keys. "Did you hear?" one of them said quietly. "The board meeting?" "Yeah. They're announcing the new majority owner today." The other employee leaned closer. "Any idea who it is?" The first one shook her head. "Management's been quiet about it all week." Across the lobby, guests moved through the marble hallways unaware that one of the most important decisions in the hotel's history was about to be announced upstairs. Bellhops wheeled luggage. The concierge desk buzzed with requests. And in the elevator heading toward the executive floor, three very confident men were still laughing. The same three men from suite 1903, the ones who had spent the morning mocking the housekeeper. The elevator doors closed, and one of them loosened his tie. "You know what I'm curious about," he said. "What?" "Whoever bought this place." Another man chuckled. "Well, whoever it is, they better know how to run a luxury hotel." The third man leaned against the elevator wall. "Relax," he said confidently. "People like us are the ones they usually listen to." The elevator chimed as it reached the executive floor. The doors opened, and suddenly the tone changed. The hallway outside the boardroom was filled with executives. Men and women in tailored suits stood in small groups reviewing documents, checking phones, whispering about projections and investment reports. At the end of the hall stood a pair of tall wooden doors. Behind those doors, the future of the Grand Meridian Hotel was about to be decided. One of the businessmen straightened his jacket. "Let's go see who the new boss is." They walked toward the doors. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was even tenser. The room was large and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A long, polished table stretched through the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs. At the head of the table sat Gerald Lancaster, the chairman of the hotel's board. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:59 p.m. The room was almost full. Executives shuffled papers. Someone cleared their throat. Another investor leaned toward his colleague. "Any word on the buyer yet?" "No idea," the other whispered. "All we know is they bought controlling shares last week." Gerald topped his pen lightly on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "we'll begin shortly." The doors opened. More executives entered, including the 3 businessmen from Suite 1903. They found seats along the side of the table and settled in comfortably. One of them whispered to the other, "Let's see what kind of genius bought this place." Another smirked. "Hopefully someone who understands how real business works." Gerald glanced around the table again. "Are we waiting for anyone else?" someone asked. Gerald nodded once. "Yes." "Who?" "The new majority shareholder." The room grew slightly quieter. Everyone expected someone impressive, a famous investor, a corporate leader, a hotel magnate, someone powerful, someone obvious. What no one expected was what happened next. Because at exactly 3 p.m., the boardroom doors opened again, and standing in the doorway was the housekeeper, Clara Whitmore. For a moment, no one spoke. Several executives frowned, assuming she had entered by mistake. One of the businessmen from Suite 1903 leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Is she lost?" A few people chuckled quietly. Clara stepped inside calmly, holding the same leather folder she had carried earlier. Her posture was steady, her expression neutral. She walked toward the table. Halfway across the room, the hotel's security manager stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "I'm sorry, but this meeting is private." A few executives nodded. Someone whispered, "Staff meetings are downstairs." Clara stopped walking. She looked at the security manager. Her voice was calm. "I'm aware." He gestured toward the door. "This meeting is for owners and board members only." From the far side of the table, one of the businessmen spoke under his breath. "I think housekeeping took the wrong elevator." A few people laughed. The security manager sighed. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside." Clara didn't move. Instead, she turned slightly toward the head of the table, toward Gerald Lancaster. "Mr. Lancaster," she said gently, "would you like me to sit down?" The room froze. Gerald slowly stood. The confusion on several faces deepened. Gerald cleared his throat. "Yes, please do." A wave of whispers spread across the room. The security manager looked confused. "Sir?" Gerald gestured toward the empty chair at the head of the table. "The seat next to mine." Clara walked forward. The room watched in silence as she placed her leather folder on the table and calmly took her seat, the same seat reserved for the majority shareholder. Across the table, the 3 businessmen stared, their expressions slowly shifting from amusement to confusion to something much heavier. Gerald opened the folder in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I would like to formally introduce the new majority shareholder of the Grand Meridian Hotel." He turned toward Clara. "Miss Clara Whitmore." For 3 full seconds, no one spoke. Then someone gasped quietly. One of the businessmen leaned forward. "You've got to be kidding." Clara met his eyes calmly. "No," she said, "I'm not." Another executive flipped through the documents in front of him. This can't be right." Gerald nodded. "The paperwork has been verified by legal counsel." Across the table, the same man who had snapped his fingers at her that morning stared in disbelief. "You're telling me," he struggled to finish the sentence, "you're the one who bought the hotel?" Clara folded her hands on the table. "Yes." Another investor leaned forward. "But he hesitated. Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "Housekeeping?" The room went quiet again. Clara smiled gently. "Yes," she said. "I suppose that's what you saw this morning." Across the table, one of the businessmen shifted uncomfortably, because suddenly, the memory of their conversation in Suite 1903 felt very different. Clara opened the leather folder and slid several documents across the table. 72% controlling interest, she said calmly. The hotel officially transferred ownership at noon today. Gerald nodded. All shares verified. Someone whispered, "My God." The room slowly absorbed what had just happened, but the most uncomfortable part was still coming. Because Clara leaned back slightly in her chair and looked directly at the three men from Suite 1903. Her voice remained calm, almost friendly. "I believe we met earlier today." No one spoke. One of the men swallowed hard. Clara tilted her head slightly. "In the presidential suite." Silence. The other man stared at the table. Clara continued. "You were discussing business strategy." She paused. "And something about people who don't belong." The words hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. No one laughed now. No one moved. Clara rested her hands calmly on the table. "I find hotel operations fascinating," she continued, "especially the way people behave when they think no one important is listening." The chairman shifted slightly in his chair. The executives glanced nervously between the men and Clara. And for the first time that afternoon, the three businessmen realized something terrifying. The woman they mocked that morning had heard everything. But the most surprising part wasn't the embarrassment. It was the expression on Clara Whitmore's face. Because she didn't look angry. She didn't look vindictive. She looked thoughtful, almost curious, as if she were still deciding something. And the decision she was about to make would change the entire future of the Grand Meridian Hotel. But the question now wasn't whether she had the power. Everyone in that room understood that. The real question was this: what would the new owner do with it? And the answer was something none of them were expecting. For several long seconds after Clara Whitmore revealed herself as the majority shareholder, the boardroom felt frozen in time. No one spoke. No one shifted in their seat. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. At the far end of the table, one of the businessmen from Suite 1903 rubbed his forehead as if trying to wake himself from a strange dream. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding," he muttered. Clara didn't react. She simply folded her hands calmly on the polished table. Gerald Lancaster, the chairman, cleared his throat. "It isn't a misunderstanding," he said firmly. "Miss Whitmore legally acquired 72% of the company's shares this morning." The words landed heavily. 72%. That meant one thing: control. Across the table, another investor whispered quietly to his colleague, "She owns the hotel." Clara glanced around the room slowly, taking in every expression: shock, embarrassment, suspicion, and in a few cases, fear. But none of those emotions seemed to disturb her. If anything, she looked thoughtful, like someone observing an experiment. Finally, the man who had snapped his fingers at her that morning spoke again. "You expect us to believe this?" he said, gesturing toward her. "You were pushing a housekeeping cart 2 hours ago." Clara met his eyes calmly. Yes. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, but Clara continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. I've been working in this hotel for 6 weeks. Now that made several heads turn. 6 weeks? Someone asked. Gerald looked surprised too. You never mentioned that. Clara nodded slightly. That's because I wanted to see how the hotel actually operates. She leaned forward slightly. Not the version written in reports, the real version. Someone shifted in their chair. Another executive frowned. What exactly does that mean? Clara's voice remained soft. It means I wanted to see how employees are treated. She glanced toward the 3 businessmen again, and how guests behave when they believe someone is beneath them. The room grew quiet again. The men avoided her gaze. One of them cleared his throat. Well, if we said anything earlier that was taken the wrong way, Clara raised her hand gently. No need. He stopped talking. Clara smiled faintly. I wasn't offended. Now the room looked even more confused. You weren't? Gerald asked. Clara shook her head. No. She leaned back in her chair. In fact, I found the experience very useful. The executives exchanged puzzled glances, because if she wasn't angry, what exactly was she planning? Clara reached into her folder and removed another document. This hotel has excellent facilities, she said calmly. Beautiful architecture, strong brand recognition, loyal customers. She paused. But it has one very serious problem. Someone leaned forward. What problem? Clara's eyes moved slowly across the room. A culture problem. The words landed quietly, but heavily. Across the table, the 3 businessmen shifted again. Clara continued. Luxury hotels aren't defined by marble floors or expensive furniture. They're defined by people. The people who work here, and the people who stay here. Gerald nodded thoughtfully. That's true. Clara looked toward him. But over the past 6 weeks, I've watched something concerning. She turned slightly toward the rest of the room. Too many guests believe that staff members are invisible. No one argued. Too many employees believe they must tolerate disrespect to keep their jobs. One of the younger executives nodded slowly. And too many managers pretend not to see it. The room fell silent again. Clara closed the folder. But today, she said calmly, that changes. Now the curiosity in the room grew stronger. Gerald leaned forward slightly. What exactly do you mean? Clara stood. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. Because when she stood, she suddenly looked very different from the quiet housekeeper they remembered. Confident, authoritative. The kind of presence that fills a room without raising its voice. She walked slowly toward the window overlooking the city. 6 weeks ago, she said quietly, I inherited a substantial amount of money. Several eyebrows lifted. My late husband owned several properties. He passed away earlier this year. Her voice softened briefly. But before he died, he told me something. The room listened carefully. He said, Clara, if you ever invest in something, make sure it's something that treats people well. She turned back toward the table. So I started researching hotels. Someone whispered, that's how she found this place. Clara nodded slightly. Yes, but financial reports don't tell you everything. She paused. So I came here myself. The realization slowly spread across the room. You worked undercover, one executive said quietly. Clara smiled slightly. You could call it that. She walked back to her seat. And I learned a lot. Her eyes rested briefly on the 3 businessmen. For example, she continued calmly, I learned how quickly people judge someone based on a uniform. No one laughed this time. Clara sat down again. But the interesting thing about judgment, she added gently, is that it reveals far more about the person making the judgment. The words hung in the air. Gerald leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "So what happens now?" he asked. Clara opened her folder again. "Now we rebuild the culture of this hotel." Someone raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Clara smiled slightly. "With a very simple rule." She slid a printed document toward the center of the table. Gerald read the title aloud. Employee Respect Policy. Clara nodded. Effective immediately. Another executive leaned forward. "What does it say?" Clara folded her hands. "It says that no guest, no matter how wealthy, has the right to mistreat hotel staff." The room grew still. One of the businessmen frowned. "You're going to turn away paying customers?" Clara met his gaze calmly. "I'm going to turn away disrespect." A murmur spread through the room. Gerald studied the document. This would make the Grand Meridian the first luxury hotel in the city to enforce something like this. Clara nodded. "Exactly." Another executive leaned forward. "And if a guest refuses to follow the policy," Clara's voice remained calm, "then they're welcome to stay somewhere else." The room fell silent again, but something interesting had changed. The tension from earlier was gone. Now the atmosphere felt respectful, because the people sitting around that table were starting to understand something. Clara Whitmore hadn't come to punish anyone. She had come to fix something. Across the table, one of the businessmen from Suite 1903 finally spoke again. His voice was quieter now. "Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." The room watched closely. Clara tilted her head slightly. "For what?" He hesitated. "For how we treated you this morning." Clara studied his face for a moment. Then she smiled gently. "I appreciate that." But then she added something that surprised everyone. "You know what the interesting thing about apologies is?" The man looked nervous. "What?" "They only matter if behavior changes afterward." The room grew thoughtful again. And for the first time that afternoon, the people in that boardroom realized something extraordinary. Clara Whitmore hadn't just bought the hotel. She had already started transforming it. But the biggest test of that transformation was about to happen, because downstairs in the lobby, the same guests who mocked her that morning were still enjoying their afternoon drinks. And in just a few minutes, they were about to find out who the new owner of the Grand Meridian really was. By the time the board meeting ended, the sun had begun to dip behind the tall buildings surrounding the Grand Meridian Hotel. Golden light streamed through the tall windows of the executive floor, casting long shadows across the marble hallway outside the boardroom. Inside the room, the tension that had once filled the air had slowly settled into something quieter. Respect. Clara Whitmore closed the leather folder in front of her and stood from her chair. Around the table, executives gathered their papers more slowly than usual, because the truth was, none of them had expected the meeting to end the way it had. They had expected anger, maybe retaliation, possibly humiliation for the people who had insulted her earlier that day. But Clara had done something far more powerful. She had chosen dignity. Gerald Lancaster stood beside her as the last of the board members left the room. "I have to admit," he said with a small smile, "that was not what I expected." Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "What were you expecting?" He chuckled softly. "Well, if someone had treated me the way those men treated you this morning." He paused. "I might have handled things differently." Clara looked out the window toward the city. "Anger can feel satisfying in the moment," she said quietly, "but it rarely improves anything afterward." Gerald nodded thoughtfully. "You're going to change this place." Clara turned back toward the table. "That's the plan." But just as she picked up her folder, the door opened again. One of the hotel's managers stepped inside. "Ms. Whitmore?" "Yes?" "The guests from Suite 1903 are asking to speak with you." Gerald glanced toward her. "Well, that didn't take long." Clara considered the request for a moment. Then she nodded. "Send them in." A few minutes later, the three businessmen stepped carefully into the boardroom. The difference in their demeanor was obvious. Gone were the confident smiles from that morning. Gone was the casual arrogance from the presidential suite. Now they looked uncomfortable, nervous. One of them cleared his throat. "Miss Whitmore." Clara gestured politely toward the chairs. "Please sit." They did. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, the man who had snapped his fingers at her earlier leaned forward. "I want to apologize," he said. Clara studied him quietly. "For what, exactly?" The question caught him off guard. "For the way we spoke to you this morning." "And why does that matter now?" Clara asked calmly. The man hesitated. "Well," he struggled for the right words, "because we didn't realize who you were." Clara tilted her head slightly. "That's interesting." The three men exchanged uneasy glances. Clara continued gently. "So if I had still been a housekeeper, the apology wouldn't be necessary." The question hung in the air like a soft echo. None of them answered. They didn't need to. Clara nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." For a moment, the room was completely quiet. Then Clara surprised them. She smiled. "Fortunately," she said calmly, "this meeting isn't about punishment." The men looked up in confusion. "It isn't?" Clara shook her head. "No." She leaned back in her chair. "You see, the purpose of today wasn't to embarrass anyone. It was to make something very clear." The men listened carefully. Clara's voice remained gentle. "This hotel is going to be run differently from now on." She paused. "Every employee here deserves respect. From the housekeepers, to the bellhops, to the front desk staff, to the kitchen team, and even to the people cleaning the floors at midnight." The three men nodded slowly. Clara continued. "And every guest who stays here will be treated with the same level of courtesy. But courtesy goes both ways." Gerald stepped forward slightly. "Starting tomorrow," he added, "the Grand Meridian will enforce a strict respect policy." Clara nodded. "If any guest mistreats a member of our staff," she paused, "they will be asked to leave the property." The words landed softly, but firmly. The three businessmen looked stunned. "You'd really turn away paying customers?" one of them asked. Clara smiled gently. "I'd rather lose a booking than lose the integrity of this hotel." The men sat quietly for a moment. Then the man who had spoken first nodded slowly. "That's fair." Clara stood. "So the consequences today are very simple." The men straightened in their seats. "For the remainder of your stay," she continued calmly, "you will treat every member of this hotel's staff with the same respect you would expect from them. And if you cannot do that," she paused, "then the Grand Meridian may not be the right hotel for you." The message was clear, direct, but dignified. The men stood, and this time, they looked Clara Whitmore directly in the eye. "Thank you," one of them said quietly. Clara nodded politely. "You're welcome." They left the boardroom quietly. When the door closed, Gerald exhaled slowly. "That," he said, "was the most polite warning I've ever seen." Clara smiled slightly. Sometimes quiet consequences are the most powerful ones. Later that evening, as the hotel lobby settled into its evening rhythm, Clara walked slowly through the marble hallways again. But this time, she wasn't wearing the housekeeping uniform. She wore a simple navy coat. Employees greeted her as she passed. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." "Good evening." Near the elevator, a young housekeeper pushed a cleaning cart down the hallway. The woman looked nervous when she noticed Clara approaching. Clara stopped beside her. "How is your shift going?" she asked gently. The housekeeper blinked in surprise. "Good, ma'am?" Clara smiled. "If anyone gives you trouble, you come tell management immediately." The woman nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Clara continued toward the lobby. And as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she looked back at the hotel for a moment. The Grand Meridian glowed softly under the city lights. A beautiful building, but now a better one. Because sometimes the most important changes in a place don't come from renovations or profits. They come from something far simpler: respect. And that's the lesson Clara Whitmore had delivered that day. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through dignity. Because the truth is, you never truly know the story of the person standing quietly in front of you. And the way you treat them says far more about you than it ever will about them. So let me ask you something. If you had been in that hallway that morning and you saw a woman pushing a housekeeping cart, would you have treated her any differently? Or would you have made the same mistake those guests did? Tell us in the comments. What do you think happened that night after those men returned to the lobby? And if you thought this story was surprising, just wait until you hear what happened in the next case. Because sometimes the quietest people carry the most powerful stories. Subscribe for more real-life twists you won't see coming.